Welcome to Night Echoes. If you like horror stories, don't hesitate to hit the like button and subscribe. My name is Arthur. I'm a restorer and cataloger of old documents. My job basically consists of walking into dusty old places, sorting through libraries that have spent decades rotting away, and telling rich owners how much their piles of old paper are worth. It's solitary work, tedious, and, most of the time, exhausting. In mid-November, they sent me up into the mountains of western North Carolina. The firm had been hired to appraise the private library at St. Lazarus Plantation, an enormous old tobacco estate that had sat abandoned since the 1980s. The plan was to catalog everything quickly so the property could go up for sale before the end of the year. The drive was a nightmare. After I left the main highway, I spent nearly 3 hours on a gravel road that kept narrowing, swallowed up by mountain laurel and fog. With every mile I climbed, I felt the altitude press against my ears, and I watched the signal bars on my phone disappear one by one until the screen read a useless "no service." I reached the property a little before 5 in the afternoon. I was exhausted, my back aching from the potholes, with only one thing on my mind: set up my gear, get through the most urgent books, and sleep. Waiting for me at the rusted-out gate was Earl, the caretaker. He was a man in his 60s, sun-worn skin and rough hands, who lived in the nearest town, about an hour away. He wasn't unfriendly, but you could tell he was itching to leave before the sun went down. He barely said hello before handing me a heavy ring of keys and giving me a rushed walkthrough that felt more like a formality than a welcome. He showed me where the diesel generator was. He warned me not to use the bathroom down the east hallway because the pipes were busted. And he showed me how to jam the kitchen door shut with a chair since the lock didn't hold anymore. All very practical, all very ordinary. When he finally started toward his old pickup to leave, he stopped with his hand on the door. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes up on the second floor of the house. "Say, Professor," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, a little uneasy. "This house is real old, and the wood's all swollen up from the damp. If you hear strange noises up there tonight, like somebody's dragging furniture around, or the wind gets down the chimney and sounds like somebody talking, don't you let it spook you. That's just normal. Folks get to thinking they hear things that ain't there. You shut your door, get on with your work, and pay it no mind. Ain't nothing to it." I nodded, thanked him, and watched him drive off. His warning struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. I've slept in 16th century monasteries and abandoned mansions out in the middle of the desert. I know exactly how an old building sounds when the temperature drops before dawn. The wood contracts, empty pipes whistle, and the mind, when it's exhausted and sitting in dead silence, tries to make sense of white noise. I set myself up in the library, an enormous room lined floor to ceiling with mahogany shelving on the ground floor. I switched on the generator, plugged in my work lamps and my laptop, and put water on for coffee. I was so absorbed in sorting the book lots that the first 3 hours flew by. The air was heavy, sure, that sharp smell of wet earth and old paper. But my mind was busy with dates, authors, and signatures. It was close to 1 in the morning when the silence of the woods broke. I was transcribing a title into my laptop when I heard it. It came straight from the ceiling, from the room directly above the library. A heavy sound. It sounded exactly like someone had set their hands on a solid wooden trunk and dragged it 4 inches across the floor. a slow, deliberate drag. I stopped typing. I sat completely still, listening to my own breathing. My mind, trained to find logic in everything, started processing. It's the house settling, I thought. It's the wind knocking against some loose shutter. Maybe a big animal, a raccoon, or a bobcat that got in through the roof. I took a sip of cold coffee. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the burn of accumulated fatigue. I looked up at the ceiling for another couple of seconds, waiting for the sound to repeat so I could confirm my wind theory. But nothing came. Just the constant, monotonous hum of the diesel generator working away in the distance. I sighed, shook my head, laughed at my own nerves, and put my hands back on the keyboard. I had to finish cataloging the first section before I slept. Paranoia is a luxury you can't afford when you've got a deadline. I forced myself to stare at the screen, typing with unnecessary force so the sound of my own fingers would drown out the house's echo. Over the following 3 hours, the dragging sound upstairs didn't repeat. But the silence of the plantation grew so dense my ears rang. The old structure creaked, the wood groaned as it drank in the pre-dawn damp, and every gust of wind against the tall windows made me tense my shoulders. Past 4 in the morning, when the burning in my eyes made it impossible to make out another letter in the ledgers, I closed the laptop. The short walk from the library up to the bedroom they'd made up for me on the second floor was an exercise in pure willpower. I switched off lights behind me as I went, feeling that childish, irrational urge not to look toward the shadows in the hallway or at the closed door of the upstairs room. I dropped onto the bed without undressing, leaving my flashlight within arm's reach, and lay a long while staring at the ceiling in the dim light, listening to the distant purr of the generator, until sheer physical exhaustion finally crushed my paranoia and dragged me down into a heavy, restless sleep. Daylight has a particular way of making you feel foolish about the fears of the night before. I woke up a little after 8 in the morning. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the shutters, revealing dust suspended in the air and giving the library a peaceful, almost melancholy look. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and laughed at myself, remembering how I'd frozen over a simple creak in the wood. In the light of day, St. Lazarus Plantation wasn't a threatening place. It was just a damp old building badly in need of upkeep. I threw myself into the work. The collection was fascinating. I found first editions on botany, tobacco export records from the early 20th century, and a series of handwritten ledgers kept by the old overseers. Skimming through one of those logbooks, dated 1924, I found several entries about the punishments handed out to field hands who tried to steal tobacco leaf. The overseer didn't use a whip. He made them climb from the creek up to the main house on their knees, over sharp shale and gravel until their legs bled. He called them, in an almost reverent tone, the penitents. I read it with the detached fascination of a historian. It was a gruesome detail, a reflection of the brutality of the era, but to me it was nothing more than old ink on yellowed paper. My mind was focused on the historical value of the document, not its emotional weight. Around noon, I ran into a logistical problem. I found a leather trunk in a corner that held the original architectural plans for the plantation and topographic maps of the land. They were enormous scrolls, nearly 6 feet long. The library tables were covered with sorted books, and I had nowhere to spread them out without risking tearing them. I decided to use the glass sunroom next to the library. It was a wide corridor bathed in natural light, with a herringbone brick floor perfect for unrolling the maps. The only obstacle was a dozen heavy wicker and wood chairs grouped in the center, arranged in a tight circle, as if someone had walked away from a meeting 30 years ago and never come back. I didn't think twice. I grabbed the chairs one by one and dragged them toward the walls to clear the center of the room. The sound of old wood scraping against brick echoed through the whole ground floor. I spread out my maps, weighted them, down with makeshift paperweights, and spent the rest of the afternoon photographing and cataloging the plans. It was a hugely productive day. By the time I noticed, the sun had already dropped behind the mountains. The fog rolled in all at once like a gray curtain swallowing the sunroom's windows, leaving me staring at nothing but my own reflection in the glass. I decided that was enough for one day. I grabbed my camera, went to the kitchen to fix myself something to eat, and sat down to go over my notes. The air had turned cold again, but I felt calm, in control of the situation. Then the lights flickered. The kitchen bulb let out an electrical buzz, dimmed to an orange glow, and died completely. A second later, the monotonous drone of the diesel generator outside coughed twice and gave out. The house sank into absolute silence and a darkness so thick you could almost touch it. I let out a sigh of annoyance. I didn't feel afraid, just deeply irritated. Earl had warned me the generator burned through fuel fast and that the filter sometimes clogged if you ran it too many hours straight. I switched on my phone's flashlight, went to my bag, and pulled out a high-powered handheld flashlight. I put on a jacket, grabbed the keys, and went out through the kitchen door toward the back of the house. The cold hit my face immediately. Outside, the fog was thick as soup. My flashlight beam bounced off the moisture in the air, letting me see barely a couple of feet ahead. I walked carefully across the wet grass to the small metal shed where the generator sat. Sure enough, the main tank had run dry. I grabbed a spare fuel can that Earl had left there, unscrewed the cap, and started pouring the diesel into the tank. The smell of fuel filled the air, masking the smell of wet earth. I was focused on not spilling the fuel when I heard a rustle. It came from the tobacco field, about 30 feet to my right where the thick brush started. It sounded like dry leaves crunching and branches snapping under considerable weight. I froze. I set the can down on the ground and pointed the flashlight into the darkness. "Hello?" I called out. My voice came out thin, swallowed almost instantly by the fog. "Anybody there?" Silence. My logical mind kicked in fast. Somebody from town saw the lights, knew the plantation was occupied, and came to see what they could steal during the blackout. Or maybe it was a lost hunter. I grabbed the heavy wrench sitting next to the generator, feeling the adrenaline stiffen my muscles. I took a couple of steps toward the edge of the yard, sweeping the tobacco field with the bright beam of the flashlight. "This is private property," I said, raising my voice, trying to sound a lot more confident than I felt. "I've got a gun. Get out of there." The beam of my flashlight stopped dead. The white light caught a figure among the brush. There was someone there, but they weren't standing. They were on their knees in the mud, back to me. They wore a shirt of rough burlap so old and rotted it seemed to melt into the color of the dirt. They weren't moving. Not trying to run, not trying to hide. Completely still, head bowed down. A cold knot formed in my stomach, but my brain kept clinging to normalcy. It's an old man, I thought. He's hurt, or he's drunk. "Hey." I took another step, lowering the wrench a little. "You okay?" You need help?" The figure stopped being still. Very slowly it began to turn. But it didn't turn its body, only its head. It rotated over its right shoulder at an angle so forced I heard the wet crack of vertebrae from where I stood. When the beam of my flashlight lit up its face, my logical mind shattered into 1,000 pieces. It had no face. Tied over its head was an old burlap sack, blackened and rotted, pressed flat against the contours of a skull that didn't seem to have eyes or a nose beneath the cloth. But at the bottom of the sack, at about the height a mouth would be, the fabric was soaked through with a thick black liquid that dripped slowly onto its chest. Terror seized my lungs. I wanted to back away, but my legs wouldn't respond. The creature raised a bony, sore-covered arm and pointed directly at me. No, not at me. It was pointing at the house behind me. And then, from beneath that rotted sack, it made a sound. It wasn't a scream or a growl. It was a drowned, wet whisper, like someone trying to speak with their lungs full of mud. I dropped the flashlight. I dropped the wrench. The survival instinct hit me like a whip crack. I turned and ran for the kitchen door, tripping over my own feet. I burst inside like a cornered animal, slammed the heavy oak door shut, threw the bolt, and, remembering Earl's mundane warning, dragged the heavy wooden table over to jam it against the handle. I dropped to the kitchen floor, in total darkness, gasping for breath, shaking uncontrollably. Outside, in the silence of the night, I heard a sound. The sound of a body dragging itself on its knees across the gravel, slowly closing in on the kitchen wall. I stayed curled up against the cabinets, knees pulled to my chest, holding my breath until my lungs ached. The sound of joints scraping over gravel stopped right on the other side of the oak door. Seconds later, I heard the scrape of rough cloth against the wood, as if the thing were leaning its full weight into the entrance, feeling blindly for a weakness in the frame. I didn't scream. I didn't ask who was there. I knew any sound would give me away and destroy the one physical barrier between me and that thing. I spent the rest of the night in that position, shaking from the sudden drop in temperature and the crash of adrenaline, listening to the dull drip of that black liquid seeping under the gap beneath the door. Only when the black of the window began to lighten to the pale gray of dawn and the scraping outside had stopped completely did I dare get to my feet. There was no time to pack or to rationalize. In the light of morning, the logic was brutal and simple. I had to leave. I left the laptop in the library, left my restoration tools, my notes, my clothes. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and opened the front door of the plantation house, gripping the heavy fireplace poker. There was no one outside. The yard was empty, wrapped in a freezing drizzle. But in the mud in front of the kitchen there were deep, parallel furrows, as if someone had dragged heavy sandbags off toward the thick brush of the tobacco field. I ran to my truck, started the engine, and floored it down the gravel road without letting the engine warm up. I was ready to drive straight to the city and hand in my resignation that same day. But the geography of the mountains had other plans. Barely 2 miles out, rounding a tight curve that hugged the mountainside, I slammed on the brakes. The tires slid in the mud and the truck stopped inches from disaster. The rain that had lashed the region overnight had triggered a massive mudslide. Tons of red clay, sharp rocks, and uprooted trees blocked the road completely, swallowing the route down to town. I got out of the truck in the rain to assess the damage, but the reality was undeniable. It was impossible to cross on foot without sinking to the waist, let alone by car. I pulled out my phone, hoping against hope the elevation might give me a signal. 0 bars. I switched on the truck radio, searching for any emergency broadcast, but got nothing but static and the distorted hum of some far-off station. I was trapped. I looked up at the sky. Heavy black clouds were rolling fast down the mountain, promising another downpour. Staying inside a vehicle on unstable ground was suicide. With a resignation that tasted like bile and panic climbing up my throat, I turned the truck around and headed back to the plantation. I got back a little after noon and set about turning the library into a bunker. It was the safest room. The bookshelves muffled outside sound, and the windows had solid wood shutters, which I closed and bolted from the inside. I brought in bottles of water, a couple packs of crackers, and secured the door. I sat down in the middle of the room to wait, trying to convince myself the stone walls would hold, that I just had to make it through until the next day, when someone from town would notice the blocked road and send heavy equipment. But the third night didn't fall. It collapsed. Around 6 in the evening, the light died completely, and darkness took hold of the property once more. And with it, they came. This time, it wasn't a single, isolated rustle out in the yard. It began as a distant murmur of crushed gravel that kept multiplying from every direction. Dozens of knees striking the cobbled path that climbed from the fields up to the main house. The sound was rhythmic, constant, almost military in its cadence. Then came the scraping, all at once. Dozens of bodies wrapped in rough cloth rubbing against the outer walls of the house. They weren't pounding on the walls, weren't breaking windows or shouting. They seemed to be feeling along the structure in complete silence, searching for an opening, like a blind tide of black mud. I gripped the poker until my knuckles ached, telling myself over and over that I'd checked every lock. But then I heard a hinge creak somewhere inside the house. It came from the sunroom. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered a small, crucial detail. The old service door connecting the sunroom to the back laundry room had a busted lock. I'd noticed it the first day and completely forgotten about it in the middle of my panic. The sound of dragging across the brick floor of the sunroom confirmed my worst fears. They were inside. Terror pushed me to crawl under the mahogany desk and cover my ears. But instinct demanded I know what I was up against. If they were coming into the library, I needed to know from where. I crawled across the floor in total silence, over to the thick double doors separating the library from the sunroom. The doors didn't seal perfectly. There was a thin vertical gap, barely a couple millimeters wide, between them. I held my breath and pressed my eye to it. The sunroom was lit only by pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows. The figures were there, at least 12 of them. They moved on their knees, in spasmodic, painful movements, wrapped in those same blackened burlap sacks. But they weren't tearing the place apart or desperately hunting for someone to attack. Their actions were methodical, almost liturgical. They were moving the wicker chairs, the same chairs I had dragged toward the walls the day before to lay out my maps. They pushed them slowly, using their shoulders and their covered heads, dragging them back toward the center of the room. They were rebuilding the tight, suffocating circle I had broken by intruding. Once the last chair was set back in its original place, the creatures stopped. With terrifying unison, all 12 figures sat down in the wicker chairs. Their broken necks hung at impossible angles over their wet chests. And then, without a sound, They all slowly turned their faceless heads toward the library door, directly toward the gap where I stood watching. I threw myself backward, pulling away from the gap as if simple eye contact through the wood could burn me. Terror dried my mouth completely. I braced for the crash, for the impact of bodies slamming against the door trying to break it down. But there was no chaos, no screaming. Instead, the silence of the house grew oppressive, broken only by the metallic groan of the wrought iron bolt. They weren't attacking it. The heavy bolt, the one I myself had secured hours earlier, began sliding, fraction by fraction, backward, pushed by an invisible, constant pressure from the other side. The metal screeched against the rusted plate for what felt like an eternity, until the latch popped free with a dry snap that echoed through the library like a gunshot. The thick oak doors swung open with agonizing slowness. A gust of freezing air swept across the library floor, carrying with it an unbearable stench, a suffocating mix of graveyard dirt, rotted cloth, and old blood. Self-preservation crushed any rational thought. I crawled in total silence across the floorboards and squeezed under the solid mahogany desk at the back of the room. It was a massive piece of furniture, enclosed on 3 sides, forming a small, dark refuge where I barely fit, curled into a fetal position. I hugged my knees, pressed my back against the cold wood, and covered my mouth with both hands, squeezing my eyes shut so hard I saw sparks. Then the sound entered the room. The knocking of kneecaps against the wooden floor echoed through every corner of the library. They weren't there to ransack the place. They weren't tipping over shelves or desperately hunting for their prey. They walked in a perfect, methodical procession, circling the perimeter of the room. I opened my eyes just a sliver. From my hiding spot at floor level, my field of vision was limited to the lower part of the room, dimly lit by the moon coming through the tall windows. I watched the first figure pass, then another, then another. Terror froze my blood as I saw the details the darkness of the yard had hidden from me. The kneecaps striking the floor had no skin. Decades of constant contact with sharp stone had flayed the flesh down to bone, exposing blackened cartilage and torn tendons that oozed that same thick black liquid. Their feet dragged, dead and useless, wrapped in torn rags. There were at least 15 entities moving in a solemn circle around the reading tables. The stench was so thick it made me gag, but I swallowed the bitter taste down, forcing myself not to cough, not to make the smallest sound. Panic had me on the verge of blacking out. I felt my heart pounding so hard against my ribs I was sure they could hear it. The procession went on for what felt like hours. The hypnotic rhythm of bone against wood was shredding my nerves. Suddenly, the knocking stopped dead. A tomb-like silence fell over the library. I watched, barely 6 feet from my hiding place, as a pair of ruined knees slowly turned until they pointed directly at the gap under the desk. The figure broke from the circle. Dragging itself forward, fraction by fraction, it advanced toward me. I closed my eyes, prayed to a god I'd stopped believing in years ago, and held my breath until my lungs burned. I heard the scrape of burlap dragging across the floor, growing louder, closer. The wet crack of breaking vertebrae sounded right in front of me. I opened my eyes on pure instinct. The creature had crouched down. Its head, covered by that blackened, soaked sack, peered under the desk, mere inches from my face. The stench of decay hit me like a physical blow. I could hear the sound of black liquid dripping from the sack onto the floorboards, right between my feet. It didn't attack me. It didn't make the slightest violent move. Instead, the figure tilted its head, brushing the sack against the floor, and let out a whisper. It was a guttural litany, a prayer spoken through a throat full of mud. The words made no sense in any human language, but the cadence was that of a desperate confession, an endless, agonized plea. I stayed frozen, shaking uncontrollably, forced to listen to the sound of death whispering in my ear, trapped by the closeness of something that didn't belong to this world. The litany stopped abruptly. A bony, grayish hand, its nails long and rotted like claws, slid across the floor toward me. I let out a muffled groan against my own palms, bracing for the cold touch. But the hand didn't touch me. It opened its fingers and let something fall onto the floorboards, right at the toe of my boots. With one last crack of its neck, the entity lifted its head, turned, and dragged itself back toward the circle. The macabre rhythm resumed at once. The procession began filing out of the library, moving down the hallway, gradually vanishing into the darkness of the house until silence fell absolute once more. It took me nearly 20 minutes to work up the nerve to lower my hands from my mouth. My body rigid, my muscles cramped from the tension. I looked down at the floor, lit by a single shaft of moonlight. There, on the wood, lay an ancient rosary. It wasn't made of wood or silver. The beads were small fragments of human bone, crudely carved, strung together with rusted wire stained with black blood. I didn't move until the flat gray of dawn finally filtered through the library windows, dissolving the darkness at last. My knees were numb and I tasted iron in my mouth, blood from having bitten my lips to keep from screaming. When I finally managed to crawl out from under the desk, my legs shook so badly I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The house was in complete silence, but the evidence of the night before was undeniable. The smell of decay and disturbed earth clung to the wood, and a trail of drops of that thick black liquid ran the length of the floorboards, marking the path the procession had taken toward the exit. I didn't go back upstairs for my clothes. I didn't grab the laptop, the camera, the notebooks. The only thing I took was that bone rosary, shoving it into my jacket pocket with a revulsion that numbed my fingers, driven by an irrational need to have physical proof that I hadn't lost my mind. I left the plantation. The drizzle had stopped, leaving behind a cold that cut to the bone. I walked the gravel road until I reached the mudslide from the night before. Without thinking, I started climbing the mountain of red clay, rock, and splintered trees. I sank to my knees, tore my nails apart, clawing at the dirt to keep from sliding into the ravine. But fear numbed the pain. It took me almost 2 hours to cross the slide. On the other side, I walked 9 miles down the empty highway, my clothes caked in mud, my eyes vacant until the first houses of the town appeared through the fog. I reached the town square a little before noon. I collapsed onto a bench outside a small roadside diner, exhausted, feeling my lungs burn with every breath. The owner saw me, made the sign of the cross under her breath, and hurried into the kitchen. A few minutes later, the person who walked back out wasn't her. It was Earl. The old caretaker sat down across from me. He set a cup of hot black coffee on the plastic table without a word. He didn't seem surprised to see me covered in mud, pale and shaking. In fact, there was a deep, heavy resignation in his eyes. "I told you, Professor," he murmured, taking a sip of his own coffee, not looking at me. "Told you if you heard things, you shut your door and paid it no mind." I reached a trembling hand into my pocket and pulled out the rosary. I let it drop onto the table. The sound of bone fragments hitting the plastic made Earl go white. He pulled his hands back from the table as if the thing were red hot. "They didn't want to hurt me," I said, my voice so hoarse I barely recognized it. "They left it for me. They whispered something to me and they left it. What in God's name are they, Earl?" The old man stared at the rosary with something like reverent terror. He swallowed hard and lowered his voice, making sure no one else on the street could hear. "Old man who owned St. Lazarus was a cruel man, Professor. Field hands who stole or tried to run. He'd make 'em climb the mountain on their knees over the bare rock, hauling stones till they bled out. A lot of 'em died that way. When the old man passed, the plantation rotted, but they stayed trapped. They're the penitents, still making their rounds night after night, looking for someone to hand their guilt to, so they can finally rest." He looked me in the eye for the first time. His expression was one of pure pity. "That's why the firm from the city sends somebody new out there every so often. Ain't nobody ever gonna buy that plantation. But the owners know that if they don't send somebody for the penitents to see, those things come down into town looking for us instead. They didn't hurt you none 'cause they didn't want your life, Professor. They wanted a witness, looking for somebody to take their penance off their hands. And you, picking that thing up, you accepted it." I said nothing. The weight of his words crushed me harder than the mountain of mud I'd just climbed over. I caught the first bus that came through town and didn't stop until I reached Atlanta. I quit the firm that same afternoon by email and blocked every number they had. I threw the bone rosary down a storm drain, trying to convince myself that would end the nightmare, that putting distance between myself and those mountains would bring my sanity back. But terror doesn't work that way. Some things, once you've seen them, stick to you like a dense shadow. 3 years have passed. I live in a 4th-floor apartment surrounded by the noise of the city, by concrete and asphalt. I try to live a normal life, but there are nights, especially when the cold sets in and the rain hits the windows, when the traffic noise seems to fade away completely. The early morning turns into a silent void, and then, right on the other side of my apartment door, I hear it. The wet sound of flayed knees striking the concrete, waiting patiently in the hallway. Thanks for listening. If you have a story you'd like us to tell, don't hesitate to send it in. The information is in the description. See you soon.